Testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode, The Mystery of the Nephite Kings. This episode will be released at Radio Free Mormon as well as at Mormon Sunday School. It has to do with my continuing study of the small plates of the Book of Mormon. Now, these small plates comprise the beginning of the Book of Mormon all the way up to the beginning of the Book of Mosiah. Here is the title slide. It is lesson 16 in Mormon Sunday School. By the way, the tagline is where you learn stuff you're never going to hear about in regular Sunday school. Once again, Mystery of the Nephite Kings, lesson number 16. But first, let's do a recap. And it's going to be a brief recap because we've been doing quite a study here on these small plates and learned a lot of interesting things. First off, going back to lesson 13, we covered the fact that the Book of Mormon appears to describe a society much larger than it would take to do the things described in the Book of Mormon, whether it's warfare or building a temple or all sorts of things that they did in the early stages of Nephite history, in the first couple of generations of Nephite history, when the Book of Mormon describes a much smaller group of Nephites than would be necessary in order to conduct all of these large-scale projects. Lesson number 14 covered the fact that the Book of Mormon authors, for no discernible reason, appear to be at least as anxious as Joseph Smith regarding making sure the reader knows there is a second set of plates, sometimes called the small plates of Nephi, and those small plates of Nephi were specifically for the purpose of recording the more spiritual things. And finally, in the last lesson, lesson number 15, the 7 generations from Jacob to Mosiah II appear to be too few to account for the length of time that passed. For example, Jacob's son Enos is still alive 179 years after Lehi left Jerusalem. And so we know that Jacob was born at least 9 years after Lehi left Jerusalem, or at least no more than 9 years after he left Jerusalem, leaving 170 years between Jacob's birth and the death of his son Enos. So if we have 170 years and Jacob waits until he's 70 years old to have Enos, to beget Enos as his son, then Enos has to live 100 years before he writes in his plates that he is almost getting ready to die. So these are some of the problems that occur in the small plate section of the Book of Mormon. We're going to talk about another one, but first, let's briefly recap, of course, that this is the problem that Joseph Smith was thrust into when the first 116 pages covering this time period from the beginning of the Book of Mormon up to the beginning of the Book of Mosiah were lost. And he had to back and fill and come up with an idea as to how he could reproduce a record that would cover that same time period, but that would not be subject to being called a fraud because he didn't translate it accurately the second time. He was worried that that 116 pages was still out there, that it had not been destroyed, but it could be brought forth and compared against his production of the Book of Mormon and shown that it was a fraud. So he had to come up with an idea. And this lesson today is going to deal somewhat more with the problems that he encountered and the traces and evidence he left behind in the text of the Book of Mormon, that this is exactly what Joseph Smith was doing. Lesson 13, 14, and 15 cover some of those problems. We'll cover another problem today. Now, the small plates disappear at the start of the Book of Mosiah. Some people who had watched the episode had asked the question, is there any place else later on in the Book of Mormon where the small plates are referenced? The answer is no. As far as the Book of Mormon is concerned, they exist only for the small plate section from the beginning up to Mosiah. Never after that, to my knowledge. If I'm wrong, correct me, please. But to my knowledge, there is no place after that where the small plates are referred to. They are returned to the kingly line, the royal line of Nephi from the line of Jacob, and they appear to remain as a concrete set of plates that Mormon finds many hundreds of years later after he's abridged the record and he's getting ready to finish his work, and then he stumbles upon this set of plates, the ones that go from the beginning of the Book of Mormon up through the Book of Mosiah, the small plates of Nephi. He does not abridge them. He simply includes them because God whispers to him that he needs to do that. And even though God doesn't tell Mormon exactly why it is he needs to do that, we know from Joseph Smith and from church history that the reason he needed to do that was because 116 pages were going to get lost. And this was going to fill the gap. Unfortunately, God did not think just to send an angel with a flaming sword to Joseph Smith and say, no, you're not going to let go of these 116 pages. Damn it. No means no. And then none of this would have had to have happened. All of this extra effort would never have had to have happened among the Nephites keeping a second set of plates and all this sort of stuff. So the small plates disappear at the start of Mosiah. The small plates cover exactly the narrative time covered by the Book of Lehi, i.e., from the start of the Book of Mormon down to the start of the Book of Mosiah. Sometimes those small plates are referred to as the Book of Lehi. Apparently, they were written by Lehi, and presumably Lehi would have been said, I, Lehi, having been born of goodly parents at the beginning of the 116 lost pages, the original record. 2, the small plates do not get mentioned again in all the rest of the Book of Mormon. As I say, if I'm wrong about that, please point it out to me. I am not aware of any place. They seem to vanish once their utility is gone in order to replace this section of the Book of Mormon. They are never mentioned again. And number 3, it appears the very idea of having a second set of plates to cover the more spiritual aspects comes to an end at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah. They're not needed anymore after that. Apparently, it's no longer needed to have a separate record covering the more spiritual aspects of Nephite history. No, it's just all going to go down the royal line of kings at this point, at least as long as they have kings. They won't have kings that much longer after Mosiah. Then they go from a kingship to a judgeship. It's the opposite of what happens in the Old Testament, where they go from judges to kings. The Book of Mormon goes from kings to judges. So I write that I believe we do not read anywhere after that of there even existing a second set of plates for the more spiritual things. Conclusion on the small plates recap. Number 1, the small plates appear to be a contrivance on the part of Joseph Smith to allow for the first several hundred years of Nephite history to be covered, in spite of the fact that the 116 pages were lost. Not only do they fit exactly the time period they are needed for, no more and no less, nobody appears to know anything about them after their usefulness comes to an end. This could be because when Mosiah through Moroni were being produced, Joseph had not hit upon the idea of the small plates yet. And there may be an exception to this, which I will bring up later. Okay, let's continue. Seams in ancient texts. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about this, all right, before I get to that quote, because we all know what seams are in clothing. Seams occur where one piece of clothing or cloth is put together with another piece of material, and they are put together and then they are sewn down the edges to make one piece. The fact that there were originally two pieces of cloth is betrayed by the fact that there is a seam in between. It is the seam that tells us that originally there were two pieces of cloth. We usually don't think about it that much. We become so accustomed to having seams in our clothing that we tend to overlook them. But that's what a seam does. The same kind of theory applies in literary studies. If you have one piece of literature and another piece of literature, and I'm just talking about text at this point, and they are put together by a redactor, they will often leave a seam where you can tell that there were originally two different pieces that were brought together. I want to give you an example of that, and there's a great example of that in the Gospel of John. So here we go with this quote. Inconsistencies in John's narrative, sometimes called literary seams. I'm going to take issue with that because the inconsistencies themselves are not called literary seams. The inconsistencies can betray the existence of a seam, and that's what we have here in the Gospel of John. But it provides the strongest evidence that the author of John most likely used several written sources when constructing his text. Authors who compose their books by grafting several sources together don't always neatly cover their tracks, but sometimes leave literary seams. The writer of the Gospel of John left clues as to how he comprised his text, which become more apparent as we examine the text attentively. Now, the section of the Gospel of John that we're going to be looking at is chapters 13 through 17 and up to chapter 18, verse 1. It's a number of chapters. He's talking a great deal to his disciples in the upper room prior to going to the Garden of Gethsemane about the Holy Ghost. And we find out that at the end of John chapter 14, remember it's been going 13 and 14, 2 full chapters so far in this discourse that Jesus is giving to his disciples. At the end of John 14, after delivering a sermon of about 2 chapters, Jesus says to his disciples, "Arise, let us go hence." That's important. Arise, let us go hence. You would think they would be going somewhere right after that, wouldn't you? Why else would Jesus say, "Arise, let us go hence"? So the reader of John might expect Jesus and the 11 disciples to get up and move to another location, say the Garden of Gethsemane. But instead, Jesus begins another discourse. He starts with, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman." And that's in John 15:1, right after he says, "Let's arise and go hence." He starts talking again. Jesus then goes on for several more chapters about the Comforter, his resurrection, his nature as the Son of God, and the intercessory prayer. And his resurrection would obviously be Jesus's resurrection, not the Comforter's resurrection. But notably, they haven't gotten up and left. In fact, the disciples do not get up until John 18, where we read in verse 1, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where was a garden, into the which he entered, and his disciples. Why would Jesus tell his apostles to get up and leave, only to then give a lengthy speech for 3 chapters? This all makes sense if we see the text containing these literary themes. So, what is proposed here, and what seems to be rather obvious from the text, is that there were 2 discourses of Jesus that the person who composed John had in his possession. And he put both of those together, but there was a seam that was left that betrayed the existence of the 2 original sources. And this seam is the fact that in the middle of the discourse, Jesus says, "Let's get up and get out of here." And he keeps talking now for several more chapters before they finally leave. Suggestive as this evidence is of the existence of a seam and originally 2 sources here, the case is made rather ironclad, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most scholars, I would say, by this additional fact. In his final meal with his disciples in the Gospel of John, Jesus washes the feet of the 12. After the exchange with Judas, and after Judas leaves to go and betray Jesus, Peter asks Jesus, "Lord, whither goest thou? Where are you going?" John chapter 13:36. A few verses later in the next chapter, Thomas essentially asks the same question. He says, "Lord, we know not whither thou goest, and how can we know the way?" That's John 14:5. Remember, this is before the seam at the end of John 14. Both of these questions are asked in the first document, the one that is going to have the second document added to it. This is where we seem to have another likely literary seam. It's actually the same seam. 2 apostles specifically asked Jesus where he was going. After some instruction, Jesus says, "I go my way to him that sent me, and none of you asketh me, whither goest thou?" That's John 16:5. See, that's in the second text that's being sewn together here. So in the first text, you have 2 disciples asking Jesus, "Where are you going?" And in the second text, Jesus is asking them, "How come none of you are asking me where I'm going?" This exchange makes perfect sense if we see this as separately gathered source material sewn together by a later redactor or author working to improve separate texts into a unified narrative. Now, what does this have to do with the Book of Mormon? Well, it seems that there are seams in the Book of Mormon. And we're going to talk about one of those seams right now. And indeed, this has to do with the mystery of the Nephite Kings. Nephi was made king over the Nephites. I think we know that. And prior to his death, Nephi ordained another man to be the next king. But the text does not give us the second king's name. Jacob 1, verse 9 says, "Now Nephi began to be old, and he saw that he must soon die. Wherefore he anointed a man to be a king and a ruler over his people now, according to the reigns of the kings." Now we would expect that that person, that man that Nephi anointed to be the king, would be his son. And indeed, the text doesn't say it's not his son. The text actually doesn't tell us anything about this man that Nephi ordained, except we know it wasn't Jacob, because he gets the plates now to carry on the spiritual part of the Nephite history. Then Jacob tells us that all the kings were named Nephi, regardless of what their real name may have been. Remember that part in the Book of Mormon? Now, Nephi appears to have had children. First Nephi 17:1 says, "And it came to pass that we did again take our journey in the wilderness, and we did travel nearly eastward from that time forth. And we did travel and wade through much affliction in the wilderness, and our women," seems to include himself, "our women," he was married, "did bear children in the wilderness." And Second Nephi 5:6 says, "Wherefore it came to pass that I, Nephi, did take my family, and also Zoram and his family, and all the rest of the people who followed him, and they split from the land of their first inheritance because their dad Lehi had just died. Things are getting hot with the Lamanites, and so they've got to get out of Dodge." But that is the example here. So we would be led to expect from the text that the person that Nephi ordained or anointed to be the next king would be his son, even though the text doesn't specifically say it. And this reticence on the part of the Book of Mormon to identify who this person is that Nephi anointed king is remarkable, especially in a book that seems over hasty to explain every unusual thing and even the normal things that happen in the book. It wants to explain everything. Here, it's a complete mystery. And why is that? That's the mystery we're going to go into here. The mystery is made even greater by the fact that all Nephite kings named Nephi, Jacob 1:10, the people having loved Nephi exceedingly, he having been a great protector for them, having wielded the sword of Laban in their defense, and having labored in all his days for their welfare, wherefore the people were desirous to retain in remembrance his name. They love that Nephi so much, they just want to keep that name around. And whoso should reign in his stead were called by the people second Nephi, third Nephi, and so forth, kind of like the English kings, according to the reigns of the kings. And thus they were called by the people, let them be of whatever name they would. So there is a royal line starting with Nephi. Nephi is made king, and every one after that, every king after that, regardless of their name, they have regular names, they have personal names like Nephi and Jacob, right? But they are not called by their real names. They are called second Nephi, third Nephi, and so on. They're all called Nephi. So this is strange. Now, making this mystery even more mysterious is the question of where have all the Nephis gone? After Jacob informs us that all the kings after Nephi will be named Nephi, we never encounter any of these kings in the text. As far as the Book of Mormon is concerned, Jacob and his line might as well be living in a completely different world from the Nephite kings. I mean, we know that they're right next to them, right? They live in the same society, but they never get mentioned in the small plates between Jacob and King Benjamin. Instead, the focus shifts over to Jacob and his descendants, who, for some unexplained reason now, become the keepers of the plates. Again, this is something that's not explained in the Book of Mormon. We have all the names of Jacob's line, but no names from Nephi's line. Dan Vogel has suggested that the reason for this may have to do with the lost 116 pages, that Joseph Smith had the names of the kings listed there down to the Book of Mosiah, all their original names, that Joseph could not remember the names of the line of kings from Nephi down to Benjamin, and therefore came up with this idea as a way to work around this problem. Not only does he not follow the expected line of the records being kept by the kings and have it go from Nephi over to his brother Jacob and then down in the separate line until the place where the 116 pages ended with Benjamin, with King Benjamin. It fits exactly. And yet, we don't know anything about what's going on over there in the royal line. And therefore, because Joseph could not remember the names of the line of kings and probably other things as well, but I think this is probably a correct idea on the part of Dan Vogel, and therefore came up with this idea as a way to work around the problem. Now, what about King Mosiah the first, King Benjamin, and King Mosiah the second? Those names aren't Nephi. What's going on here? After hundreds of years of kings named Nephi, who are never mentioned in the text, suddenly, and for no explained reason, we begin to encounter the Nephite kings. Remember, it goes down Jacob's line, and then it goes over to the royal line again. But when we do, they have names that are not Nephi. After King Mosiah the first, we have King Benjamin and King Mosiah the second. He will be the last king before they switch to a system of judges. This also suggests the earlier idea of calling all kings Nephi may have been a stopgap measure to avoid having to list their real names. In other words, the text tells us that all the kings are named Nephi, We don't encounter any of those kings until we get hundreds of years later. And the next time we do encounter the kings in the royal line, they're not named Nephi. They have their original given names, Mosiah, Benjamin, and then Mosiah. And here's a diagram that kind of shows this. Here we have Nephi at the top in the middle. On the left, we have the large plates where it says 2nd Nephi, 3rd Nephi, 4th Nephi, unknown, unknown, right? Because these are all Nephis going down here. They're the keepers of the records on the large plate. So those pass down through 2nd Nephi, 3rd Nephi, 4th Nephi, unknown, unknown, although they would be Nephis. And then all of a sudden, we get to King Mosiah and King Benjamin and King Mosiah II. And what's going on over here on the other side is Nephi now. He gives the large plates to his son, presumably, and then he gives the small plates over here to his brother Jacob. And this is a good diagram because you can see that Jacob now gives the small plates to his son Enos, Enos to his son Jerem, Jerem to Omni, Omni to Amram, who does a lateral pass over to his brother Chemish, who gives them to his son Abinadam, who gives the small plates to his son Amaleki, and now Amaleki transfers them over to King Benjamin. Again, I want to repeat this because it's important that Amaleki says the reason he's passing them over to King Benjamin is because he does not have a son. Now, up here with Amram, 3 generations prior to that, Amram says he didn't have a son, and that's why he gave him to his brother, Chemish, who then passed him down to his sons. Amaleki just says he doesn't have a son. He doesn't say that he also doesn't have a brother that he could have handed them off to. No, instead of that, he just gives them to King Benjamin, which completes the circuit, and it gives an account of this narrative, of this time period in the Book of Mormon from the beginning up to King Benjamin, which happens to be the exact same time period covered by the lost 116 pages. And by the way, I would note that the very fact that Jacob gives the plates to his sons and then their sons and then their sons, and only when they don't have a son do they give it to a brother, then son, son, and then over to King Benjamin, that would suggest that Nephi would have given the plates to his son, even as Jacob gives the small plates to his son, which makes it certainly likely that the same pattern that was followed by Jacob handing the small plates down from father to son was followed by Nephi with the large plates handing them down from father to son. And once again, why is it that even though the text tells us in the small plates that all the kings are called Nephi, that suddenly when we finally encounter a king, it's Mosiah, not Nephi, and then Benjamin, not Nephi, and then Mosiah II, not Nephi. What I'm suggesting is that this, like the Gospel of John in chapters 13 through 17 and up to 18 verse 1, like that passage shows a seam and 2 separate texts being woven together. Even so, we can see the seam here of 2 different texts being woven together. And those 2 texts are the small plates of Nephi and the large plates of Nephi. But there's a seam that indicates the presence of a redactor. Because remember, in John, it's not John doing this. It's the person who's writing in the name of John. John wouldn't need to do that. It's a person who's comprising a text in the name of somebody else and taking 2 separate texts and putting them together and leaving telltale traces called seam. Even so, in the Book of Mormon, this would not be accounted for. The seam here in the small plates would not be accounted for by Mormon being the redactor. It could have been caused by Mormon, except for the fact that Mormon tells us he did not redact the small plates. This is an independent group of plates, all written in the first person, that he saw after he finished the abridgment, and he put with the record because God prompted him to. Therefore, he is not the redactor of the small plates. He's the redactor of everything else in the Book of Mormon, but not the small plates. The Book of Mormon tells us that much, which means that if Mormon is not the redactor here, it was Joseph Smith who was the redactor. He's the one who put these 2 texts together, the text representing the small plates and the other text representing the rest of the Book of Mormon. And it is because of the presence of this rather obvious seam in the Book of Mormon that this looks less like a narrative that Joseph Smith translated and more like 2 different texts that Joseph Smith, as the redactor, tried to put together and did put together, but left telltale traces in the seams. The Mosiah priority, just a reminder, Remember that virtually all Book of Mormon scholars, including faithful scholars, agree that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mosiah through the end of the Book of Mormon before commencing First Nephi up to around the beginning of the Book of Mosiah. The small plate section occurred last in the translation process. This makes it significant that all Nephite kings from Nephi down to King Mosiah are all named Nephi, regardless of what their real name is. Their real names are never mentioned, and the focus of the book shifts to Nephi's brother Jacob and Jacob's descendants, who become the keepers of the small plates. And even though we encounter no kings named Nephi, except for the first, as soon as the text mentions kings again, they aren't named Nephi, but by their real names of Mosiah, Benjamin, and Mosiah. Jacob's line restores the keeping of the plates to Nephi's line with King Benjamin. I mentioned this before, but here's the verse that says that. Omni chapter 1, verse 25. And it came to pass that I, Amaleki, began to be old and having no seed. See, he doesn't mention he doesn't have a brother. And having no seed, and knowing King Benjamin to be a just man before the Lord, wherefore I shall deliver up these plates, the small plates, unto him. And that's where the small plates go back to the royal line at exactly the point up to which the narrative had progressed before the 116 pages were lost. It's an exact fit. If it had been maybe a little bit shy of that or a little bit more than that, it might have been more believable, but no, it's an exact fit. So in other words, these small plates do exactly the job that was necessary for them to do, caused by the loss of the 116 pages. Now, I mentioned earlier that I would cover what seems like it might be an exception to the rule about the small plates never being mentioned again in the Book of Mormon. They are never mentioned again by that name, the small plates, and the record is never referred to. But there is an instance where it appears that Alma quotes Lehi. And what Alma says in Alma 36:22, he says, Yea, methought I saw, even as our father Lehi saw, God sitting upon his throne, surrounded with numberless concourses of angels in the attitude of singing and praising their God. Yea, and my soul did long to be there. Well, this is a word for word quote from 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 8 from Lehi, which reads, And being thus overcome with the Spirit, he, Lehi, was carried away in a vision, even that he saw the heavens open, and he thought he saw God sitting upon his throne, surrounded with numberless concourses of angels in the attitude of singing and praising their God. You see, it's a word for word quotation that Alma seems to be doing of Lehi. How could Alma be doing that unless he did have possession of the small plates so that he could be quoting from Lehi, which apparently he's doing? What is going on here? Is Alma quoting from Lehi on the small plates as it's presented? If so, Alma must have had access to the small plates, unless this part is identical to what was recorded on the large plates, the quote from Lehi, or in other words, that this same quote was on the lost 116 pages. This straightforward interpretation would be faith promoting, i.e., how can Alma quote Lehi from a record that hasn't even been produced yet? Or, on the other hand, is Lehi quoting Alma, which would actually be Lehi quoting Alma, quoting Lehi. Or in other words, if Joseph Smith is producing the book, that he puts in a quotation in Alma of Alma quoting Lehi, and then works that quotation back in to his reproduction of that narrative when he is translating the small plates after he gets done with the end of the Book of Mormon and is coming around to start at the beginning and take it up to the beginning of Mosiah, the Book of Mosiah. Did Joseph Smith put this in Alma specifically to replicate it in Lehi's own words when he got there? This seems clever, but I do note the quoted material happens only 8 verses into the Book of Mormon or into the small plates translation, as if it were something that were being held in reserve for such a translation as this. And of course, if we're going to look at that quote of Alma from Lehi, we also have to look at something similar with the name Liahona. We all know that the Liahona was the ball or the compass that Lehi found outside of his tent, and that led Lehi and his family through the wilderness according to the faith that they had in it. But the example of the Liahona is sort of the opposite of this other quote. So in a similar but opposite vein, Alma knows that the compass used by Nephi was called the Liahona. And we get that from Alma 37 and 38. And now, my son, I have somewhat to say concerning the thing which our fathers call a ball or director, or our fathers called it Liahona, which is being interpreted a compass, and the Lord prepared it. So not only does Alma call it a Liahona, Alma specifically says that our fathers called it a Liahona. But the word Liahona does not appear on the small plates. So wherever Alma's getting this from, it can't be from the small plates. We would presume it would be from the large plates, which he would naturally have access to. So Alma must be getting the word Liahona from the large plates. This raises the question of whether Alma even knew about the small plates, given the fact he never mentions them, and also that Mormon talks about them as something he found only after abridging the record. And you can find that in Words of Mormon, chapter 1 and verse 3. Conclusion. If the original story in the Book of Mormon that was on the lost 116 pages had the plates being kept by the line of kings, which makes sense. We know that the kings kept a set of plates, the large plate, but it would make sense for the kings to keep the plates even as they do after their return to King Benjamin. If the original story on those lost 116 pages had the plates being kept by the line of kings, which, as I say, would make sense, and if all those kings had different names, then it makes sense that Joseph Smith would not be able to remember those names in order down to King Mosiah the first. Joseph may therefore have come up with the idea to have the plates go down the line of Nephi's brother, Jacob, where he could supply new names for Jacob's descendants down to King Mosiah the first. So in the original 116 pages, it would make sense that the plates would go down through the line of kings and that the line of the kings would all have names. They probably don't even mention anything about Jacob or his descendants. So if Joseph Smith gets in a position where he can't remember the names of the kings or lots of other details associated with it, but let's just go with the names of the kings right now because that's a good concrete example. What would make sense for him in order to come up with another record would be now to create a second set of plates, a small set of plates, and give it to Nephi's brother so it can go down through his line. And in that record, nobody in the Nephite line is mentioned. It is almost hermetically sealed off from each other, Jacob's line from Nephi's line, so that you could start reading with Jacob and go all the way down to Words of Mormon, and you would have no idea really that there were any other kings right next door with their own set of plates. But what may give the whole game away is the fact of this seam in the Book of Mormon. And that seam has to do with the mystery of the Nephite Kings. And with this lesson, the mystery of the Nephite Kings may be solved. Going on, there is a seam in the narrative that although it tells us all kings are named Nephi, when we get to the first king, other than the original Nephi, right, whose name is given, it's not Nephi. That's a bad sentence I wrote. And basically, I think you know what it means by now. I'm probably repeating myself, and I don't mean to be beating a dead horse, but this is a very important point. Neither are his two successors, Mosiah's two successors, Benjamin and Mosiah, which end the reign of kings in the Book of Mormon. The kings were likely the keeper of the plates all the way down in the original 116 pages. And so custodianship of the plates must be returned from Jacob's line to the kings when Joseph's second translation of this portion of the history meets up with the Book of Mosiah. In this way, the Mosiah priority, coupled with a close reading of the text, may reveal why the first several books are structured the way they are relating to the names of the kings being Nephi, which is contradicted at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah. It may also reveal why the custodianship of the plates went down the unexpected line of Jacob's descendants instead of Nephi's descendants. And remember, that unexpected line of descent of the small plates is completely unexplained in the text of the Book of Mormon. But it is adequately and I think persuasively explained by the fact that Joseph Smith had to come up with a second narrative that covered the same time period without subjecting himself to the claim of fraud because he got the details wrong. Finally, it may account for why it is that Jacob's descendants transfer custodianship of the plates to Nephi's royal line at the same point in the narrative when we start hearing about the different names of the king. And so this narrative in the Book of Mormon of the small plates doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, there are a number of unanswered questions in the text, and then there's this seam with the Nephite kings and their names that we've talked about. This doesn't make a lot of sense from the Book of Mormon's narrative perspective, but it makes absolute sense if we're looking at this as Joseph Smith trying to solve the problem of reproducing the same time period of narrative, but not subjecting himself to the claim of fraud for getting names and details and the narrative sequence of events wrong in his reproduction. Joseph seems to have done a workmanlike job of making the two narratives line up, but it appears he left telltale traces of his DNA at the scene of the crime. Well, that is about all for tonight. Thank you for watching. Please click like, please click subscribe. Please leave a comment below as to what you think of my resolution of the mystery of the Nephite Kings. And I do want to thank all of my listeners who support this program, who have gone to radiofreemormon.org and made a donation there, whether it's a one-time donation or a continuing donation. Thank you so much for your support. Until next time, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.